who don't know me, like she said, I'm a beef cattle extension specialist at Auburn University, but a lot of the research that I do is forage based. And so today I'm excited to have the opportunity to talk with you all a little bit about how we kind of envision being able to use these alfalfa Bermuda grass mixtures to help potentially improve our animal performance here in the Southeast. So starting out, just our goals for today, what are we going to talk about as part of this presentation? And so the first thing I want to do is go in and talk a little bit about our animal nutrient requirements in our beef cattle systems. How does alfalfa fit in with that in terms of meeting those daily requirements? And then how can alfalfa fill in our production gaps throughout the year? Also looking at some of our different systems where we can use alfalfa Bermuda grass mixtures, I think is where we want to end up, is really how do we anticipate being able to use this on our farm? Are there certain classes of livestock that are going to benefit more from the use of these alfalfa Bermuda grass mixtures than others? So to start out with, I always like to start with this slide, and it says, look at the following picture and what do you see first? And I think as cattle producers, a lot of times our tendency is to go straight to the cows. We look at the cows, we look at the animals, and we say, hey, she's a good looking cow or she's not. I like this about her, I don't like this about her. But we have to look at the big picture, right? The performance that we get on those animals is a response to the environment that they're in. And here in the Southeast, that response is largely based on the forage system that they're on during the year. Okay, and so I think that that's an important point to think about today as we're talking about incorporating alfalfa and how that incorporation into the system can ultimately influence how well the animals in our system are performing. So the first step then in order to help improve that production system is really just to go back and revisit from the forage side, what do we have in our system and where do we think that this alfalfa technology can fit in that? And so Dr. Tucker already talked to us a little bit about site selection and how we're not going to choose our worst area but the best area where we would want to put that alfalfa. And I think the mindset is really similar in terms of if we're wanting to use this for animal performance, we want to most closely match those animals' needs with this production system. So I guess I would ask us to think about then, where in your system do you think the alfalfa could benefit you the most in terms of your animal performance? Is it with cows? Is it with calves? A combination of the two? And so those are the types of questions we really have to think about in terms of, can alfalfa then maybe provide some extended grazing or improve the overall quality of the production system that I'm in? So if we begin to tie that into our overall animal requirements and how do our forages grow in the Southeast, what do we depend upon during the majority of the year? For most of us in the coastal plain region, we're looking at using Bermuda grass and Bahia grass really as that perennial forage base that gets us through the deep summer months. And if we look at, I just overlaid when do we typically calve in the Southeast, and that might depend upon your operation, but I just broke it into a winter calving, spring calving, or fall calving system. And we can see that really for that fall calving system, which I think a lot of us are in, particularly in this region of the state, typically our Bermuda grass and Bahia grass production is going to start to decline during that time period. Okay, and so that coincides with a time of high nutrient demand with our cows during that time period. And so if we can look at adding in then some complementary forages into that system that can extend the grazing season and or improve the quality of grazing during that time period, I think that that's a way that we want to start thinking about this question. So just looking at then our different forages that are adapted to the Southeast in terms of their overall quality and how does that meet our overall nutrient demands. So I've just overlaid a few different examples here, but if we look at our dry pregnant cow in gaining condition, most of the time those warm season perennial grasses alone are going to meet her need. But really when we're thinking about the need for a higher quality system, it's when we need to make sure that we're matching whenever she's lactating or when she's in that peak production cycle. Or if we have stocker cattle, that's where we're thinking about we need something that's going to elevate the nutritional value of that production system for us a little bit better. So that's just that blue bar going across the middle here that shows us that they're going to have increased needs relative to that dry pregnant cow. And that some of our higher quality systems either have cool season forages that are incorporated into them to be able to meet that need and or legumes as part of those systems. So how does alfalfa fit into this? And I think over here on the left, this is a good example of just showing how our forage quality of those warm season perennial grasses changes throughout the growing season. And you probably noticed this, that early in the season, they look good, they're very productive, but as the season progresses and we get into that early fall time period, the quantity and the quality of those forages declines. So for example, in this table here, the values that we see for May, that's certainly more than sufficient to meet the needs of a lactating beef cow. But if we're in that fall calving system, then we're coinciding with that time where it's not maybe necessarily meeting her needs alone. So if we look at adding some complementary forages into that system, whether or not we're talking about overseeding our warm season perennials in the winter months with things like cool season annuals, or today as we're talking about incorporating alfalfa into those systems, some of the benefits for that are first from a forage growth distribution standpoint, that we can basically extend the grazing season or our forage production season by putting in those complementary forages. And in a minute we'll talk about the quality of that and how that has changed by incorporating those into our year-round production systems. So again, if we just look a little bit more specifically at our animal requirements, and this is just for a fall calving system, if we're looking at the daily nutrient requirements for energy or TDN for a mature cow, how does it change throughout the production season, and how does that coincide with our forage systems at that time? So this is just a more specific illustration then to show us that her peak needs are going to be right at the beginning of that calving season. Okay, so that's when she has the highest demand on her system. She's trying to produce milk for that calf, as well as recover from that pregnancy. So she's preparing her reproductive tract, getting ready to be rebred shortly after that time period. And so we can see that that time period really would be when we would have a peak demand for our cow-calf systems. Also, if we were thinking about stocker cattle systems, we said earlier that they have a very consistent demand for energy, because what are we wanting them to do? We're wanting them to gain over a relatively short period of time. So at least 1.5 pounds per day, but really 2 is probably what we're shooting for at most. And so we can see that their energy demands are going to be fairly consistent and elevated too. So if we think then about how can we better meet those demands with our forage systems here in the southeast, knowing that we have kind of these production gaps that occur. Specifically, we've focused on the fall of the year time period so far. But really, I think this is where we want to talk more specifically about incorporating legumes into that production system. And so we know that there's several agronomic benefits to that, one of those being nitrogen fixation that we can get from those legumes, adding diversity to the system. But I think from an animal performance standpoint, using these mixtures, we don't often think about how grasses alone, specifically our warm season perennial grasses we saw, can undermeet the needs of our cow herd a lot of times. And legumes we saw in that figure earlier are very high quality. So legumes alone are going to overmeet their needs. But by having a mixture of these two together, we're going to be more right in the middle of being able to better target and match to their nutrient requirements on a daily basis. So overall then, adding legumes to the mixture adds quality. And if we look at this, all of that is what drives animal performance in our system. So now we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about consumption of these mixtures, as well as quality of those mixtures and what we might expect specifically with alfalfa and Bermuda grass. So this is some information from America's Alfalfa, just going through the demonstrations that they've put in here in the southeast and looking at overall quality improvements of these mixtures whenever we begin to add alfalfa into Bermuda grass. And so overall we can see that we can increase the overall digestibility of those forage mixtures by adding in alfalfa, and also the crude protein percentage. Okay, so there's a lot of benefits from that, specifically if we're in hay production systems from a marketing standpoint, of being able to market based on quality of that forage relative to warm season perennials alone. If we look at overall influence that legumes can have on animal performance in terms of intake, one of the things that we often see with legumes in general is that animals will tend to consume more forage when there is a legume component in that mixture. So somebody earlier had the question about legumes and mixtures like that, and that cattle do tend to have a preference for legumes, and you'll notice that they tend to spend more time grazing those. Well, overall, that means that total in our forage system, we're expecting to have increased consumption when we add legumes into the system. So this is just a study where they were looking at incorporation of alfalfa, and it was actually into a tall fescue system. But I liked this illustration because it shows us that as the contribution of alfalfa increased, the overall forage consumption was increased whenever that legume component was added into that grass system. Okay, so if we're having greater intake in that system and the quality is elevated, that's when we would expect to have some animal performance improvements relative to a grass-based system alone. So overall, we can see that with increasing quality, we would expect increasing intake. This is a figure I like to use a lot because it kind of shows the breakdown in terms of our overall forage quality. And I think a lot of times our warm season perennial forage is going to be somewhere in this low to average quality range. And so a good rule of thumb we often say is that a mature cow is going to consume between 2 to 2.5% of her body weight per day on a dry matter basis. Okay, so if she needs to consume 2.5% of her body weight per day in dry matter, is she actually able to consume that of a lower or average quality hay product? And so we can see oftentimes that that her intake is actually a little bit lower than we would expect or what she would need to be able to maintain a certain level of production on a low to average quality system. However, as we saw earlier with the example from America's alfalfa, with increasing quality, we would expect increasing intake then of that forage. So overall, the implication of that then is potentially less supplementation in these systems where we're having higher quality forage products being produced. From a grazing standpoint, there hasn't been a lot of published literature yet in terms of alfalfa Bermuda grass mixtures, what we could expect on those. While the idea of alfalfa Bermuda grass is not a new idea, it's like Dr. Tucker mentioned earlier that with our forage varieties that we're using now, we're still trying to refine what those recommendations would be, specifically if we're looking at that in a grazing context. And so this is a study out of Arkansas where they looked at comparing either rotational grazing or continuous grazing of alfalfa Bermuda grass mixtures, and were there any animal performance differences in those systems. So they did not see any observed differences in terms of animal performance between the two grazing methods, but overall they did see that the rotational management system tended to have greater stand persistence over the 3-year study. Okay, and so that stand was able to maintain a percentage of alfalfa in it that was greater than 30%, which if we think about that number 30%, that's often what we say is kind of the threshold value of what we need to be able to maintain in our stand to get those nitrogen fixation benefits to our system. Okay, and then also just in terms of the forage allowance, or how much forage was then available for the animal to graze in that system, the rotational system tended to have a greater forage allowance compared to continuous. So overall, if we looked at the gain that they achieved in that study, and this was with stocker cattle, the gain per acre was 580 pounds per acre across those two grazing methods. And so that's very comparable actually to what we would see in some of our cool season stocker systems. And you'll notice that this grazing study was conducted from April through September. And so I think the telling point of that then is that think about how hot it gets here in July. Okay, so these animals obviously were actively grazing and still performing even through that really hot, heavy environmental conditions that we experienced then during the summer months. Also, if we look at then animal performance in these conserved forage systems, what might be our expectations? And really this is just kind of the initial data gathering step of where we want to go with this. But Dr. Tucker's students are going to talk to us a little bit this afternoon, I think, about these studies. But this is some data from a study here in Tipton where they were looking at making baleage out of alfalfa Bermuda grass mixtures. And overall, we can see, again, the quality of that product is very high. So that would be more than sufficient to meet the needs of that cow-calf pair and peak lactation, or based on our animal nutrient requirement tables, it would suggest that potentially we could meet the needs of steers gaining 2 pounds per day. Okay, but this is something that we need to move forward and do some animal performance studies with in terms of these feeding trials. But just based on the quality, obviously it illustrates that we do have potential to meet these increased demands in our animal systems. So the increasing quality really ties in with our agronomic recommendations, and that's what I wanted to talk about next, is thinking about how do the recommendations that we talk about from the site establishment and the forage management standpoint then influence us in terms of our potential animal performance. And really the key is that maintaining the appropriate harvest frequency, especially if we're making hay or baleage out of these mixtures, is important to us, not only from a stand persistence standpoint, but it will influence then our overall animal performance in those systems. And so we would expect in a hay harvesting system that our alfalfa Bermuda grass mixtures would probably have greater proportions of that alfalfa early and then late in the season, because we are kind of extending that growth distribution across the calendar year. And then maintaining those timely harvests would be important from a quality standpoint, just to make sure we're getting the alfalfa and the Bermuda grass at their optimum stage of production. So again, just capitalizing on the fact that we're trying to maintain that appropriate harvest frequency, because it does influence the overall quality that would then be used for our livestock later on. So from a grazing management standpoint, as we mentioned before, this is an area that we're still trying to really find our appropriate recommendations in terms of, can these mixtures be grazed, what would be the appropriate height and rest frequency that would be required for this to be a sustainable system here in our region of the Southeast. And so this is a project that I think we're going to get to go see these plots this afternoon, right? Okay. This is a project that Auburn and the University of Florida are working with the University of Georgia on a regional basis to better define what are the appropriate height and then rest frequencies that would be needed if we were going to try to rotationally graze these mixtures here in the Southeast. And so from a plant persistence standpoint, really these are the two biggest factors that we have to keep in mind to make sure that we're maintaining those stands to be able to have as much longevity as possible. So just to kind of wrap up, I wanted to talk about how do we think then that these alfalfa Bermuda grass mixtures would fit in to our production system here in the Southeast. And again, it goes back to you asking the question about your farm. Where do I have the area that has the greatest need? Okay, is it with cows, calves, or replacement females? I think there's a lot of different options of where either conserved forage through hay and baleage could fit as a supplemental forage or as the main forage that we would use as part of their diet on a daily basis. But just going forward, about a few examples of where I think this could be a potential fit, and just based on visiting with producers who are interested in putting this in their operation from a cattle standpoint, how they might envision using it. This is just some feedback from some of our producers in Alabama. And so one of those systems might be that we could use this higher quality forage as part of a preconditioning system or a backgrounding system for weaned calves specifically. And so obviously whether or not we're going to background is going to be dependent upon the cattle market conditions and projections at that time. But in terms of our target production goals in that system, we would really like to achieve 2.5 pounds per day of gain oftentimes in that system. And so depending upon the quality of the forage and the diet, that's going to largely influence our overall animal performance. But I could see that this particular mixture would be a potential fit for that system, along with additional supplementation as needed to be able to achieve that level of production. And so I think going forward, we would like to ultimately do some work looking at trying to use this baleage in terms of a preconditioning program for calves. Also, another fit of where I think this could be important from a calf standpoint, being that those calves have a very high nutrient demand, and we might like to try to provide them some additional supplementation to be able to kind of push the growth on those calves a little bit, would be looking at using this potentially in a creek grazing system. Okay, and so I like the idea of a creek grazing system for this because it would allow us to basically have a fixed time that calves would have access to that creek grazing area or that alfalfa Bermuda grass mixture, and then we would be rotating them onto a new pasture area. So from a forage management standpoint, I could see that being favorable potentially from a persistent standpoint, but also from just providing that elevated quality, again, during when we might have a production gap. Okay, so for those of you who aren't familiar with creek grazing, essentially we're just talking about setting up our fencing system in a way that would allow those calves to have temporary access to that mixture, but it would be a way that it would separate the cows from the calves. So the calves would be able to go in and out of that area when they would like to do so, and the calves would be separated from them. Okay, so calves must be trained to this system, but it's actually something that's relatively easy to do. Once they're familiar with the setup, they're going to go to it and continue to go and access that area fairly naturally. Okay, and another good thing about this, I think, is that it familiarizes them with the pasture area. Okay, so ultimately later on, as we're thinking about weaning those calves, whether you're using a fence line weaning approach, it familiarizes them with, hey, this is the area that I'm used to going in. So if we are doing some of that fence line weaning, they're at least familiar with that area as we begin that process. So overall, we've talked about a lot of different things, but I think the ultimate goal of today was really just to think about how do we tie this into how we ultimately plan to use alfalfa in our production systems. And so from that, we know from an animal production standpoint that legumes can improve our overall forage systems. Number one, from a quality standpoint, but also from an intake standpoint, because we have a higher quality product. And our biggest consideration is going to be to think about how do we anticipate being able to match what the quality of that forage is with our nutrient needs in our production system. Okay? And so, only you know best as to what's going to be the class of livestock that I think can benefit the most from using these types of mixtures. And then third, we have to ask, is this specifically going to be a fit for our system? And so I think today, as we go out and do some of the field tours, that will be a good time to be able to ask some of those questions. I'll be around for the portion this afternoon, so if you'd like to talk about it more specifically, I'd be glad to do so. So with that, if you have any questions, I'd just like to refer you to our web resources here if you're seeking additional information on this topic or anything related to forage nutrition for beef cattle. You can visit our websites at University of Georgia, Alabama Extension, and the Southeast Cattle Advisor.